Before she was ever born, a doctor looked her father in the eye and told him, in plain and careful words, not to have children at all. Not one. The warning was real, and it was written down, and it was passed along to the family. And her father, a proud, handsome man who had spent his whole life being told he was extraordinary, listened to every word of it. And then he went on to have 8. She was the 7th. Her name was Edith Minturn Sedgwick, though the world would only ever call her Edie. And by the time she was 28 years old, she would be dead, and 2 of her brothers would already be in the ground before her. And the great fortune she had been born into, one of the oldest fortunes in America, would not have saved a single one of them. This is the story of a girl who was handed everything a person can be handed at birth: land, money, beauty that stopped rooms cold, a name that reached all the way back to the founding of a nation. And it is the story of how none of it was enough, how the very thing that made the Sedgwicks who they were became the thing that took them apart, one child at a time. To understand how Edie ended, alone at 28, in the same town where she began, you have to go a long way back, into a family that even in death could only ever look at itself. The Sedgwicks were not merely rich. They were American aristocracy, in the truest sense the country allows. Edie's ancestor, Judge Theodore Sedgwick, had been Speaker of the House of Representatives in the days of Washington and Hamilton, and Chief Justice of the highest court in Massachusetts. Her mother's line was grander still. Her grandfather chaired the Southern Pacific Railroad, and her great-grandfather, a clergyman named Endicott Peabody, founded the Groton School, where presidents would send their sons. This was a family that had helped to build the country, and never once let itself forget it. But if you trace that same proud bloodline back far enough, you find something else waiting there, quiet and patient. Judge Sedgwick's own wife, Pamela, was said to have lost her mind halfway through her life. The illness, if you want to call it that, was in the family from the very beginning. It did not announce itself. It simply waited and passed down, generation to generation, until it reached the children on a ranch in California. In the hills of western Massachusetts, in a town called Stockbridge, there is a burial ground that belongs to the Sedgwick family and to no one else on earth. The graves are arranged in a great circle. Every single headstone faces inward, toward the center, so that, the family always said, on the day the dead rise again, the Sedgwicks will open their eyes and see only one another. No strangers, no outsiders, just Sedgwicks, for all eternity, turned in on themselves. They called it the Sedgwick Pie. Remember it. We will come back to it before we are through. Edie's father was named Francis Minturn Sedgwick, but everyone called him Fuzzy. He was a sculptor and a rancher, physically magnificent, the kind of man who filled a doorway and knew it. He was also, from a young age, seriously ill in ways the family preferred not to say out loud. Before he ever married, he had suffered 3 separate nervous breakdowns and been treated for what the doctors of that era called manic-depressive psychosis. And when he asked for the hand of Alice Delano de Forest, the railroad heiress, her own father did a careful and terrible thing. He went to Fuzzy's doctors and he asked them plainly whether this marriage should be allowed to produce children. The answer came back just as plainly. No, this man should not have children. The illness ran too deep. They married anyway, in 1929, and between 1931 and 1945, they had 8. Alice, then Bobby, then Pamela, then Minty, then Jonathan, then Kate, then Edie, and last of all little Suki. 8 children, born under a warning that everyone in the family knew about, and no one ever spoke of again. Let me stop here for just a moment and ask you something, and it has nothing to do with Edie at all. When you look back across your own life, all the long years of it, the good and the hard, both, is there one single year you would choose to live over again if you could? Not to change a thing, just to feel it once more. Hold that thought for a moment, and if these stories mean something to you, if you believe these women deserve to be remembered as people and not as gossip, then take a moment now to subscribe to Silk and Sorrow. It cost you nothing, and it is the only way these lives keep being told. Now, back to Edie, and back to the ranch where the 8 of them were raised behind a locked gate, taught to believe they were finer than the whole world outside it. Fuzzy raised his children the way a king raises heirs, apart and above. The family lived on a working cattle ranch called Corral de Cuati, 3,000 acres of golden California hills near Santa Barbara, and later on a second ranch near the town of Los Olivos. The children did not go to the local school. A private schoolhouse was built for them right there on the property. They did not play with other children. A local doctor came to give them their daily injections of vitamins. They made up their own games and their own private world, and at times they lived in a separate house from their parents altogether, a small tribe of blond children roaming 3,000 acres, with almost no one to answer to but each other. And all the while they were taught, quietly and endlessly, that they were superior to everyone beyond the fence. The neighbors, the ranch hands, the ordinary families down in town. When oil was struck on the land in the early 1950s, the family grew richer still. The money went up. And behind the gate, something was quietly coming apart. One of Edie's brothers, Jonathan, tried to describe the strangeness of it years later, and his words are hard to forget. They had been raised so far outside the ordinary world, he said, that when they finally stepped into it, they did not fit anywhere. Nobody could understand them. 8 children raised to believe they were exceptional, and then set loose into a world that had no place prepared for them at all. That was the true inheritance, not the land, not the oil money, that. And where, in all of this, was their mother? Alice DeForest Sedgwick was a shy, gentle, retiring woman who had married a force of nature and then let him rule the household exactly as he pleased. By every account, she loved her children, but she did not, or could not, place herself between them and their father. When Fuzzy raged, Alice looked away. When the truth in that house grew too ugly to face, Alice chose, again and again, not to see it. It is a quiet kind of failure, the failure to protect. And in a family already carrying so much, it would prove almost as costly as any cruelty. She had spent a lifetime learning not to look. She would not learn to look, even when it mattered most of all. There was a darkness inside that house that went past isolation, and it has to be spoken of carefully, because much of it rests on Edie's own testimony, given years later and impossible to prove now. According to accounts she shared with those close to her, and which biographers gathered after her death, her father was not only controlling and unfaithful, but had, she said, crossed a line no father should ever cross when she was very young. That much is her word, reported by others, and we will leave it there, with all the restraint it deserves. What the family did not dispute is the pattern around it. There is a story they passed down. Edie, still a girl, once walked in on her father with another womb, and when she tried to tell her mother what she had seen, Fuzzy showed no shame at all. He slapped her. He had a doctor called, and he said to his own daughter the words that would follow her the whole rest of her life. "You don't know anything. You're insane." And then he had her sedated, a child who saw the truth and was told she was crazy for seeing it. The first thing in Edie's life to break was her body, and it broke early, before she was even a teenager. She developed an eating disorder, a punishing cycle of starving and purging that would shadow her for the rest of her days. At 13, she was sent away to boarding school, the Branson School near San Francisco, and she lasted less than a year before she had to be pulled out. Too sick, too thin. Think for a moment about what that means. In a childhood where every single thing was controlled and watched over, the one thing Edie could rule was her own body. And so her own body became the first battlefield. It would not be the last. By the autumn of 1962, when Edie was 19 years old, the illness had won enough ground that she was sent to a psychiatric hospital, Silver Hill, in Connecticut. When her weight fell to around 90 pounds, they moved her to another facility, a division of New York Hospital, simply to keep her alive. 19 years old, and already inside the same system of wards and locked doors and worried doctors that had shadowed her father before her and her grandmother before him. Hold on to that fact, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Edie Sedgwick was already broken long before she was ever famous. The world would later say that Andy Warhol used her up and then threw her away. But the truth is harder and sadder than that. By the time Warhol ever laid eyes on her, the damage was already decades deep. He did not start the fire. He only stood very close. He to it while it burned. In 1963, still fragile but out of the hospital, Edie moved east to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to study sculpture, her father's own art, and to be near the bright, restless world of Harvard. And there, for the first time in her life, something remarkable happened. She bloomed. She became almost overnight the girl everyone in Cambridge was talking about. She was beautiful and strange and impossibly magnetic, and she gathered around her a whole court of devoted young men and women who found her the most alive person they had ever met. She spent money like water and gave it away just as fast. She was, without knowing it, rehearsing the exact part she would soon play on a far larger stage, the radiant girl at the center of the room, burning a little too brightly to last. But she was there, in Cambridge, glittering and adored, when the first of the two blows fell. It is worth pausing on what the two oldest boys had already suffered, because it is the plainest proof that the doctor's old warning had been no superstition. Bobby, the eldest, had been the golden son, Harvard-bound, athletic, charming, until, in his sophomore year, his mind gave way, and he was carried out of his dormitory in restraints. Minty, the second son, was drinking himself sick before he was old enough to drive. Two bright, handsome young men, born to every advantage the world can offer, both of them being undone from the inside by the very same inherited illness. The family money could buy them the finest hospitals in the country. It could not buy either of them a single day's peace, and within one terrible year, both of them would be gone. The first was Minty, Francis Minturn Sedgwick, Jr., his father's namesake, and the son who had the unhappiest bond with him of all of them. As a grown man, he cycled in and out of psychiatric wards, in and out of that same Silver Hill his sister had known, and, somewhere in those years, he confided to his father a secret he had carried in silence his whole life. He told Fuzzy that he was homosexual. His father did not answer with love. By the family's own account, Fuzzy turned cold, and then cruel. He tried to force his son to be someone he was not, and when Minty finally broke down and said the truth out loud, his father told him that he was no son of his. Within days, it was over. On the 4th of March, 1964, at Silver Hill Hospital, Minty took his own life. He was 25 years old. It was one day before his 26th birthday. And there is one detail from that night that tells you everything about how alone he was, and how much, even then, he loved his sister. The night before he died, Minty picked up a telephone and called Edie in Cambridge, and he told her she was the only Sedgwick he could ever hope for. He went through the whole family, one by one, and set each of them gently aside, and came to rest on her. The one he could still talk to, the last voice he wanted to hear before he went. Edie was 20 years old when that call came. She would carry it for the rest of her life. And years later she would say something that reveals just how badly this family wanted to look away from its own pain. Her mother, Edie said, denied to her dying day that it had ever been a suicide at all, even though it was written there plainly, in black and white, in both the hospital records and the police records, for anyone with the courage to read them. Alice had learned not to look. She did not stop even for this. Barely 10 months later, the second brother followed. Bobby, Robert Minturn Sedgwick, had spent years in and out of Bellevue and in a state hospital after that. That Christmas of 1964, as the family gathered back in California, Bobby was told not to come home. His father had decided he was a bad influence on the younger children, so Bobby stayed away, alone in New York, over the holidays. And on New Year's Eve, the 31st of December 1964, riding his motorcycle through Manhattan without a helmet, he drove straight into the side of a city bus on 8th Avenue. He never woke up. He lingered in a coma for 12 days, and on the 12th of January 1965, Bobby Sedgwick died. He was 31 years old. And Edie told a friend afterward something that chills the blood. She said she had known Bobby was going to die. She believed in her heart that he had done it on purpose, that the crash had been no accident at all. 2 brothers gone inside a single year. Minty at 25, Bobby at 31. Both of them carrying the same illness a doctor had named and warned against before their mother had ever married their father. And Edie, 21 years old now, and the sole surviving witness to all of it, did the only thing she knew how to do with a grief that size. She buried it. She did not fall apart where anyone could see. She turned instead and ran as hard as she could toward the brightest lights she could find. The timing of it is almost unbearable when you lay it out plainly. On her 21st birthday in April of 1964, one single month after Minty died, Edie came into a trust fund of $80,000 left to her by her grandmother. In September of that same year, she moved to New York City. In December, just weeks before Bobby's fatal crash, she was hurt in a car accident that shattered her knee. And then, in March of 1965, with body, H. brothers freshly buried, and her own body and mind already worn thin as paper, Edie Sedgwick walked into a party and met a pale, quiet, watchful artist named Andy Warhol, and for one single year she would become the most famous girl in the world. You have to understand what the factory was, to understand what happened to her there. It was not a normal place. It was a silver-painted loft in Midtown Manhattan where a strange, glittering crowd drifted in and out at every hour of the day and night. Artists and addicts, runaways and socialites, the beautiful and the broken, all of them orbiting the pale, silver-wigged figure of Warhol himself. And Warhol had a gift, and it was a cold one. He collected people. He found the most luminous and the most damaged among them, pointed his camera at them, made them famous for being exactly what they were, and asked, in return, only that they burn brightly for him. Into that room, in the spring of 1965, walked Edie Sedgwick, beautiful, wounded, grieving, rich, and utterly magnetic. For Warhol's purposes, she was perfect. It happened almost overnight. Within weeks, he had crowned her the queen of the factory. He put her in his films, one after another, Vinyl and Horse and Beauty Number 2 and more. He took her everywhere he went, the two of them a match set, and the cameras followed. And Edie gave the world an image it had never seen before. The silver hair cropped short and shining to match his own, the black tights, the enormous chandelier earrings, the great dark eyes, the impossible careless grace. Vogue magazine reached for a word to describe her and simply invented one. They called her a youth Quaker. She was named the Girl of the Year. For 12 straight months, she was photographed more than almost anyone alive on Earth. She was 21 and then 22, and she was luminous, and she was everywhere at once. And here is the cruelest detail of that whole dazzling year. One of the films Warhol made her star in, one of the very movies that helped turn her into a legend, was titled, without a single flicker of mercy, Poor Little Rich Girl. She played, in essence, herself, the heiress with everything and nothing. The world watched it and thought it was art, thought it was clever, thought it was the very height of downtown cool, and almost no one watching had any idea that the shimmering girl up there on the screen had buried 2 brothers in the previous 12 months, or that the fortune the title was mocking had never once, not for a single day of her life, managed to keep her safe. The truth behind the glamour was far thinner than anyone knew. Warhol paid her nothing, not $1, for all those films that made her name. And Edie was burning through her $80,000 trust fund at a frightening speed, on the clothes, on the limousines she rode everywhere, and on the drugs that were closing their hand around her. The amphetamines first, and then worse things after. And then, in the autumn of 1965, she fell in love. Or she believed she had. She became briefly involved with the musician Bob Dylan, and she let herself believe it was real, that here at last was her way out, toward a genuine film career and a genuine life, far from Warhol's cold little silver kingdom. She was wrong. The end came in a single sentence, delivered by Warhol himself in a lawyer's office. He told her, almost carelessly, that Dylan had quietly gone off and married another woman. Edie sat and trembled. Everything she had reached for had just closed shut in her hand. She left the factory early in 1966, after only about a year at the very center of it, feeling used and cast aside. And from there, the story becomes a long, slow descent, and there is no gentle way to tell it. The drugs deepened their hold. She moved into the Chelsea Hotel, that famous old refuge for artists and lost souls, and it was there that a fire broke out in her room, and Edie was burned badly enough to leave scars. It was as if the very brightness that had made her famous was now, quite literally, beginning to consume her. There were more hospitals after that, and more falls, and more disappearances. A film shot over these years, called Chow Manhattan, would capture her decline directly on camera, and it is painful to watch even now. The same luminous girl, dimmed and slowed, and struggling to be who she once had been. For the next several years she drifted between New York and California, between fragile freedom and confinement, in and out of institutions on both coasts. The trust fund was long gone. The famous friends fell away one by one. The girl the magazines had crowned only a few short years before was now, to most of the world, simply forgotten. A name from a party that had already ended. And in 1967, her father died. Fuzzy, the man who had raised them all behind the gate, who had turned Minty away in his darkest hour, who had told his own daughter she was insane for seeing the truth. The son the entire family had spun around for a lifetime was gone. And still, somehow, there was no peace for Edie. The man was dead, and the weight of him would not lift. In the end, she went home, back to Santa Barbara, to the very same stretch of California coast where she had been born, in and out of care, trying with everything she had left in her to climb out of the hole she had been falling into for a decade. And there was, near the very end, a small flicker of something that looked like hope. In July of 1971, Edie married a young man named Michael Post, whom she had met in treatment. And for a little while, the people who loved her let themselves believe she might actually make it. She was 28 years old. She had already survived so very much. It seemed for one brief season genuinely possible that she might survive the rest of it too. She did not. On the 16th of November 1971, Edie Sedgwick died in her sleep of barbiturate intoxication. She was 28 years old. The coroner could not say for certain whether it had been an accident or a choice, and so the record was left exactly where so much of her life had always been left, undetermined, unresolved, unanswered. The most photographed girl in New York, the heiress to one of the oldest fortunes in America, died with almost nothing at all to her name, in the very same town where she had first entered the world. Now, do you remember the burial ground? The Sedgwick pie up in the hills of Massachusetts, where the graves all face inward so that the family will rise on the last day and see only one another forever and ever? Every Sedgwick turned toward every other Sedgwick, sealed off from the whole world for all eternity, exactly as they had chosen to live. Edie is not there. She lies far away to the west, in a small country cemetery in Ballard, California, beneath a simple stone that reads Edith Sedgwick Post. She got out. After everything, she finally got out of the circle, and yet she never truly got out at all because she died where she was born, still inside the long reach of the family that had made her and unmade her, still carrying the illness her father carried, still answering at the very last the warning that a doctor had spoken aloud before she ever drew a single breath. She was the girl who had everything, and outlived her brothers, and could not outlive the one thing all three of them shared. She was 28 years old. Her name was Edie Sedgwick, and she deserved so much more time than this world ever chose to give her.